Thank you to all three panelists. I'm really glad the role of domestic politics was emphasized because I think we tend to overstate the extent to which NATO's cohesion problems are due to lack of common purpose and so on. I think if there's anything that Russia has achieved for NATO since 2014, and it hadn't succeeded in 2008, but was to drag NATO back to a Cold War logic with deterrence being back as part of the vocabulary, and even nuclear deterrence, reaffirming a consensus around nuclear deterrence where 10 years ago these same allies were talking about dismantling nuclear sharing arrangements to support NATO deterrence. So I'm glad that the domestic aspect has been highlighted. I'm also glad, Robert, that you highlighted the concern when it comes to public awareness and attitudes vis-a-vis NATO. And of course, NATO has a fairly large public diplomacy apparatus, but I don't think the hashtag We Are NATO is quite going to cut it when it comes to bringing the next generation on board and making sure that the support for the alliance remains strong. And also thank you very much, Marc, for outlining the current state of NATO-Russia relations and also showing how China is increasingly part of the equation. And I remember the plea that we had yesterday from Sarah Muller of being precise when it comes to our levels of analysis. And I think here between the conversations we had yesterday about China and today, NATO's in an interesting spot because within its regional security dynamics, Russia is very much a big player. It's not just a spoiler versus the global equation where you see China's influence being increasingly important, but for the NATO equation, still an afterthought, so long as Russia will be threatening the Baltic states and Poland. So I would suggest that the project of a global NATO for now is still very fuzzy and aimless, regardless of the plethora of partnerships that NATO has developed over the years from Colombia to Mongolia.
Thank you very much. I really congratulate the organizers on this panel. I think it's so important to deal with domestic politics and domestic support and resilience. I mean, one of the buzzwords in Western circles is resilience, and that is very much about what you have also been talking on this panel. Perhaps a few things. I would be a speaker on the final panel, so I'm anticipating a few of these things because it really aligns very much to the things that I would like to make on the final panel. On the domestic support for NATO, I absolutely agree with what has been said, and I think if we engage our citizens back home on foreign policy issues, on security policy issues, I think we will have to be prepare for a lot of critical questions: why we are in Afghanistan, or why we were in Afghanistan, what did we do in Iraq, what did we do in Libya, because many see it as blunt failures. And so it's not only about the defense moment of NATO, that NATO provides deterrence and defense of NATO countries, but also about some missions that a lot of people, especially in Europe, have not really understood why we should be engaged with them. So I think if we engage with the citizens, and I think this is fundamental, we will have a lot of critical questions. And it's not about only selling our politics better. I think that was also one point I would like to make about the European Union. I think the European Union has a similar problem. It undersells its successes, peace, stability, prosperity for so many decades. That's not nothing, not at all. But it's not only about communication. I think it's about what these organizations deliver. As social justice and the European Union, of course, we have broader issues. We have to deliver more on social justice. And so it's not only a communication problem. One question perhaps for Marc on your discussion about NATO and Russia and European Union. Actually, I wanted to read out just 4 sentences at the final panel, but I can do it now. The global strategy of the European Union that has been endorsed in 2016 and which is the reference document for the foreign and security policy of the European Union also clearly says that Russia is a key strategic challenge. I would also not say Russia is just a spoiler. In the European perspective, it is a great power, and it's not just a spoiler. And the problem will somehow disappear over the decade. But at the same time, the global strategy says we will not recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, nor accept the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. We will strengthen the EU, enhance the resilience of our eastern neighbors. The EU doesn't speak of flanks, but of neighbors and neighborhoods, and uphold their right to determine freely their approach towards the EU. At the same time, the EU and Russia are interdependent. We will therefore engage Russia to discuss disagreements and cooperate if and when our interests overlap. In addition to those foreign policy issues on which we currently cooperate, selective engagement could take place over matters of European interest, and then they name a lot of issues. So, Marc, the question for you is, or the first question, do you see this problem, and it is Russia's intention to divide, of course, the European countries from, especially the US? Do you see this debate coming up in the circles that you have been dealing with? And the other question, a lot of researchers say that one of the motivations of Russia to do what it does is because it struggles for recognition as a great power. And if you would, as Westerners, do more on this, let's say, soft side of granting recognition, some of this aggressive behavior might disappear. I'm not sure. Also, again, a question from Marc. What do you see on this issue? Is there a real point in that? Is Russia mainly struggling for recognition, or is it way more, aggressive than some people might wish to think? Thank you.
Great. Okay, on the first set of questions, I think both Robert and Steve could chime in, and then we have a question specifically addressed to Marc.
I'm not sure what the first question was in terms of was that, it was you were more agreeing with us, and I'm like, okay.
But what can we respond to those citizens who are very critical?
Well, how we can tell the publics about what's going on? Well, what's interesting is that how attitudes have changed about intervening in Syria. So in 2012, it was British David Cameron couldn't get a vote through Parliament despite having a majority, and something that is now a recurring phenomenon there. But that was historic. Whereas a few years later, when it became when the Europeans identified the flow of immigrants from the Middle East as part of the Syrian problem, it became much, much easier for European countries to support doing things in Syria that they hadn't imagined doing, right? They were able to drop bombs on Iraq because Iraq invited that. But they were much less willing to support efforts in Syria, but that changed. Initially, it was only the Arab countries, Canada, and the United States that were willing to drop bombs on Syria. And so I think what they can do is tie the Syrian campaign to the larger challenge of terrorism and immigration in Europe. I want to be careful about that because I don't want to feed the flames of xenophobia, and so that's a delicate balance for countries to do. But I think they can justify that mission and the Iraq. They made one of the striking things at Warsaw that surprised me last summer when Stéfanie and I were at the side, not Warsaw, Brussels, at the side party for the NATO summit was the agreement to put a NATO hat on the Iraq mission. That's because the Europeans were like, well, this is not 2003, this is now 2016, 2017, and we face a threat from ISIS in the region, so we can do this stuff in Iraq. That's a huge sea change if you think about what the Europeans were saying in 2003 versus 2017. So I think people are making those connections, and I think they can make those particular connections. One of the things that I always puzzle about is this whole, and this is going to be a Steve's peeve at some point on the podcast, is this whole Eastern Front versus Southern Front thing with NATO. Because I understand that the countries that are closer to Africa are more concerned about immigration than they are about Russia. But it seems to present a false trade-off, which is if we send 1,000 troops to Latvia, does that mean that we can't handle or deal with the problems in the South? And what is it that they expect NATO to do in the South anyway to stop the flow of immigrants? Do they want NATO to start shooting up boats that cross the Mediterranean? What is the NATO role in this? And that's something I'm always puzzled by, because I understand that the folks facing South have gripes about attention, but in terms of actual effort, what is it that they want? And I know that this is partly them playing to domestic politics. They're saying if we want NATO to be a visible organization, it has to help us with this problem. But again, I don't see what a military organization is good for. We could talk about capacity building in the Middle East, But that's something that's kind of vague. That's what I'd say there is I think the South versus East thing is a domestic political thing, which is making NATO harder. But I do think NATO can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, I don't have much to say, but just that essentially defending every operation that NATO has done is not, possible, and still to make it look on an individual basis like, okay, well, Libya had, we accomplished our mission, but then there was no coalition to follow up. And arguments like that are not very good. It just leads people to say, okay, well, we shouldn't have meddled in the first place. The key is that NATO's successes are so difficult to sell because nothing happened. The Western Front, hundreds of thousands of soldiers being stationed there and not fighting. It's difficult to show a negative as a positive or as something that actually happened. Nothing happening was the end of our missions. We maintained the peace. That's a very difficult thing to show as evidence. The Kosovo War perhaps being the only exception that is usually touted as quite a success. But it's really difficult to show, okay, well, the individual fruits that you can point to may not be perfect, but the whole organization itself is sound and constantly improving. That right now is what NATO is kind of working on to make sure that people understand this capacity building that Steve was talking about in Iraq, for instance, is a skill that was built up over many years in Afghanistan specifically, and projecting security is seen as a very valuable skill now, one that Canada is excellent at. But again, the outcome of that is just, okay, well, we've got a country that has more capability to look after itself so that NATO won't have to worry about it. It's not a stirring thing, an inspiring thing to look up to, really, in my point of view.
And just to push one more point, it's really hard for somebody to say, yes, the image of George Bush on the aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished makes it very hard, and then having the Iraq war continue for many years makes it hard for any politician to spike the football now going, we've now defeated ISIS because they no longer control terrain in Iraq or Syria. Because ISIS hasn't gone away, it's become something else, it's doing more damage. But I do think that politicians can be better about, it's sort of an all or nothing for them. They need to figure out better messaging about, we have made tremendous progress in the war against ISIS. Well, there has been plenty of territory freed up from that. Now, part of it is now occupied by Assad, and that's a hard message to sell. But Iraq is no longer occupied by ISIS. And so we can claim some victories, but it's hard because this whole war against terrorist groups is, Al-Qaeda still exists. We killed bin Laden, but it still exists in some form. They mutate. So there's not going to be a VE day. And I was in Germany on VA Day this year. That was kind of strange. But there's not going to be, the confetti and the parades because these wars are different from the old wars, and that's kind of hard to sell. So you can't entirely blame the politicians because the messaging on this is just really challenging.
I'll just chime in on that, on the failures. I think that if you look at the newer missions that NATO has undertaken, they have much more modest mission designs in terms of their ability to fail. If you look at the new training mission in Iraq, you're essentially talking about military advisors working with the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. You're talking about mobile training teams working with military academies and more tactical level training like bomb disposal to help stabilize the country. So if you have a very curtailed mission like that, I think you do have an opportunity maybe to have better messaging and communicate the intent clearly. Same thing could be argued for enhanced forward presence. There's a real story there about truly integrated missions, even though it's not a NATO operation per se, because it's not run out of shape. You still see with each framework nation leading these 4 battle groups, you have their very compelling story of NATO acting collectively. And with the training focus, driving the reassurance message and the deterrence message. Again, here you have a pretty quote-unquote safe mission. So that's two things I wanted to add to that conversation, but I'm not forgetting about you, Marc.
Thanks for your question. I think I sort of approach this question in terms of a distinction between form versus substance, in a way. The substance of the policy, the official policy towards Russia, but then there's also the form and how Russia is involved in discussions, how it's treated, at least publicly on the international stage, in terms of addressing the interest and need of being treated as a great power. I think so yes, I agree with I think what's implicit in the question. I think that the current Russian leadership desires to be treated as a great power, to have a seat at the table in global politics. And I think that it's possible to come up with a policy of engaging Russia that optimizes the chance for a successful political outcome. So that would be the substance side of the question. I think in my view, as an outside observer, timing is probably critical. I've heard that a golden opportunity was missed in 2013, leading up to Maidan and the elections that brought about the exile of Yanukovych and the crisis that ensued. The EU was part of the mix in the events that led up to that point with the association agreement. And one of the critiques that I've heard is that to some extent you could make the argument that the EU, and this is drawing a parallel to I forget the professor's name out of Cambridge who wrote the book Sleepwalkers. In some ways, Europe sleepwalked into World War I, and the same sort of critique was invoked on some EU staff, that their approach to Russia in presenting the association agreement could have been better handled in addressing and including Russia in those talks. So there's a role for statesmanship in dealing with Russia. And there's also a role, I think, for Russia experts. And I think this is, ever since 2014, it has become more recognized. Certainly what I've observed in 3 countries within Europe, all of a sudden there's a lot more funding for research projects related to Russia, and also for education programs, Russian studies programs, which were lost a lot of funding in the 1990s, are now becoming more prioritized. So I think that also addresses this point in the long term. The problem is that we're beyond 2014 now. 2014 happens, and for a variety of reasons, it would be difficult to publicly make some of these gestures that could have made an impact before 2014 today, because of the tense situation. So, so there is, I think, a time and a place for the form part of how you engage Russia, but given the context today, it would be difficult to make these gestures, at least publicly. But it's something I think in the future, NATO member states, certainly the group that was brought up before, recognizes could be improved. And I think there was, I think I addressed both parts of your question. But
Thanks. I'll preface my question by saying that from 1981 to 1985, I was the Canadian representative on the NATO Information Committee, so plus échange, plus c'est la même chose. But considering that we'll all be dead and Putin will still be in power, I think we've got to look at the long term. And I always question the circumstantial network between Putin and Xi Jinping or Russia and China, because over the longer term, isn't Russia interest more closer aligned with the European? I know they've played with the Eurasian concept and he thinks it's a dream, but Putin is a tactician. He's not a real strategist, and therefore at some stage at NATO, is there some thinking about, okay, fine, isn't there a real dialogue, not just the dialogue that the NATO has always fostered and equality and all that, something bigger where indeed the discussion with Russia would go beyond the way it is going on now, with a greater recognition of the Russian interest, looking at it from the Russian eyes, like, oh, they are investing so much in the Arctic, it's a threat. Yes, it's a threat when you have 25% of your GDP that depends on the Arctic, which is the Russian case. There's a certain interest in them defending it and preparing for what they see as an antagonistic setup of countries, including, of course, NATO. So is there some thinking that goes beyond the day-to-day, what I call NATO speak, which is looks very nice and clear-cut and all that, but doesn't really go beyond some very basic points when, in fact, things could change, particularly with a guy like Putin, if he realized that China is not necessarily the best friend to have, even though you sell your oil. But you also sell your oil and gas to Europe, and that's NATO. So I think we need to think a bit beyond.
Okay, can you pass the mic to Charlotte, please?
Thank you for your presentations all, and especially Steve, thank you for saying that us, millennial and Gen Z, are not necessarily the problem. Because as we have seen in the latest European Union elections, is that we're having an improvement of participation, and also we have, even though, for example, in France, the right-wing party came first. In the elections, we have an improvement in terms of margins. Their margins are reducing, and then you have green parties coming to the forefront. But my point mainly is that it's good to educate people about NATO, and I want you all to grapple with that. But NATO, especially among people that are historically educated and politically aware, view it as an imperialist force, especially with the humanitarian crisis that happened following the death of Gaddafi in Libya. We see NATO as part of the problem of what is going on in the southern flank. And also, NATO doesn't care much about what we care about today, that is to say, humanitarian crisis and climate change. So how can we have NATO maybe change its own narrative and change what it does so that we would care about it and that the alliance is sustained in the future?
First of all, few comments. I will put my French Air Force officer hat. And for you, Dr. Saideman, I cannot comment on the contribution of the Avengers to the effort of war. But for the French contribution, I just want to clarify that the position of the French president was very clear after 9/11, and the French Air Force contributed as most as they can with logistic, fighters, and air-to-air refueling tankers since the early beginning, from 2001, and for more than 10 years. So it was in support of non-Article 5 operation, yes, but we were there.
Great, we have
for the questions.
Oh.
So 2 questions. The first one is for Dr.
Sure.
Ozawa, sorry. Around the same theme, which is the growing interest for the Arctic. So the first one, do you see the Arctic as an area of common interest and thus of potential cooperation for Russia and China? And or will it still be an area of competition? And the second part of the question is for the overall panel. So as the boundaries within the Arctic are currently contested, it seems unlikely that I would say an Article 5 could be triggered if there is a rogue a kind of rogue exploitation of the natural resources there by China or by Russia. So what would be the reaction of NATO in this case, if there is a rogue exploitation of natural resources in the Canadian EEZ? And is it leading to a kind of impasse, the same impasse that we have in Crimea right now?
Regarding NATO and humanitarian crises, we forget that NATO stopped genocide in one place and prevented it in the second place. It just happened to be in Europe, not in Africa. So that's a very positive story to tell. We could take a look back now and say Bosnia is not as successful as we like to be, Kosovo is not as great as we like it to be, but there are people who are alive today that, because NATO, when the UN failed in Bosnia in a huge way. And so I think that would be story number one for that. The challenge is NATO is a European organization. It has, often people try to impute it worldwide ambitions and abilities, but it's a European organization, North Atlantic organization. But it's, and so I don't expect it to be able to go to South Sudan or someplace like that. Just hard to get consensus to do that, particularly when other things are going on. Of course, I went to Afghanistan, which technically is in Europe, but it was the place that did inspire the first invoking of Article 5 in NATO's history. The other thing I would say is, you're actually confirming my basic stance about France, because I did acknowledge that the French SOF were very active and productive in southern Afghanistan, but they were quiet and invisible. And the French air effort in Afghanistan was also important, but not visible, whereas the battle group on the ground in Kabul was visible, but not as active. And so I think there was a very deliberate effort by Chirac to keep his commitments in 2001 and not do anything further as things changed, because he didn't want to give Bush any wins, any support after 2003. Didn't cut things off, but there were no really visible things. So while I'm sure the NATO appreciated the tremendous French air effort there, I would say that was not something that was politically salient.
Robert.
Charlotte, to you, I think there is room in Article 2 to expand a little bit on climate security, what the heck that means. If we've got climate change, how is that going to affect global security, as that is being seen as a key threat to a lot of NATO nations, but then also our partners. I would also just briefly say that the Libyan mission, successful in the NATO parameters, had no handoff whatsoever. James Patherai, who's a Canadian, has kind of warned that as part of the failure of NATO to make sure that there should be, you break it, you buy it, essentially. And then there was no proper planning for that. There was just a hope for a coalition. Now I think that is going to change NATO policy in the future, perhaps in some way lending its weight towards what Stéfanie pointed out of much lower expectations. But it also was only possible because, of course, the UN mandate and interaction with the Arab League and all these other multilateral organizations to try to make sure it wasn't an imperial kind of drop down. But of course, it's going to look that way anyways. So that's always a challenge. And then just briefly, the Arctic boundaries being contested. The Arctic Council seems to be like one of the only multilateral institutions that's working quite well, where China's playing somewhat fair, Russia as well. One of the reasons that NATO has decided not to be that Arctic active is because I think they're afraid of screwing up the one domain that right now is fairly demilitarized. So that's all I have. I'm no expert, though.
Thank you for your questions. To the first question about the long-term, the recognition of the long-term rise of China. In my discussions with officials at HQ, my impression is that there is sort of recognition of that with some more strategic-minded people, but they're much more concerned, seemingly, with the short term. And there's already so much to deal with respect to Russia. And then if you add on to that many of their national governments are in their own negotiations with China. There's I would say a high degree of caution to deal with China head on right now. With respect to the Arctic question, I think that it remains to be seen if Russia and China can cooperate in the Arctic. They've done a pretty substantial project recently, so they sort of made the first step with this Yamal LNG project that I mentioned earlier. That required a lot of investment and cooperation, and quite frankly, from the Russian perspective, it was a risky move to invite the Chinese to come and play such a major role in a strategic project for them. In the long term, however, it could easily turn into a competitive situation based on the point about the form distinction versus the substance. If China begins to treat Russia as a junior partner, and Russia, in my view, will react to this, and this will begin to affect some of their projects and ongoing negotiations for future projects. So, but because the Northern Passage is so critical and so important to China, I think at least in the short term, they'll probably be on good behavior.